Ads schmads. If you don't want ads, that's okay. Choose the Dave McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts. And hey presto, no ads.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
It is the new year, the podcast you were down. Dear listener, you are with us again. We are facing into 2025, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the team that puts the podcast together. You know, the legend, the genius. How else can I describe it? John Davis. So it's John and myself, as you know.
Devastatingly good looking.
Unbelievably handsome. The Brad Pitt of podcasting. Okay, he is Brad Pitt in Fight Club. That's what he looks like. Okay, but over here on our left, or on your right, John, is the brains behind the podcast.
Yes,
is Eliza Notaro, and she's always saying, "I don't want to come on the podcast. I've nothing to say, etc." But I want to point you to a brilliant Substack called Elizanomics. This year, watch out for this wonderful Substack called Elizanomics. Just Google it. It is the thoughts of Eliza, who is the brains behind the podcast, and somebody who we could not put this podcast together without. Not just in terms of getting the whole thing together, but in terms of all her ideas, her suggestions, her nudges. When John and I are off on one, she just goes, come on, get back on course. So anyway, Elizanomics, have a gander at it for 2025. That's one of my predictions, John.
Yes, indeed. Brilliantly written.
Brilliantly written, exactly. And today's podcast is going to be on how trade wars started by America could well, in the next 12 months, mutate into something much bigger that America might not necessarily be prepared for or have the actual wherewithal to defend itself against. So that's
the law of unintended consequences.
It's the fragile underbelly of the United States, which is its inability to pay its own way. That's what it's all about.
And just on that, Mac, again, a few weeks ago, just before Christmas, there was loads of news about, the American government shutting down, and everyone's scrambling to do a deal, and bipartisan this, and the Democrats saying that, and pushback from Elon Musk and Trump and all the rest. And this seems to happen a lot. They run out of money. The government runs out of money, and when that happens, your average civil servant in America just doesn't get paid.
Yeah.
So this seems to happen all the time. Why? And that kind of shows how strapped they are for cash.
I tell you, before we go on to the trade war, that's a very, very good question, John, because it allows me to frame what's going on in the context of this government shutdown, etc. So I'm going to take you back to, and you mentioned bipartisanship. So that's the sort of the card the Americans play at the end, which is the Democrats and the Republicans come around the table and in a bipartisan way, they do what's best for the United States. Now that is all based on the notion that there are enough Democrats and enough Republicans who have enough in common with each other to elevate the concerns of the United States over and above their party political squabbles.
Yeah.
I am not sure that in the next administration there will be bipartisanship. That's
I think you're right, yeah.
The second thing is, if you look at the history, so I'm going to bring you back to a character called Newt Gingrich.
Yes.
Do you remember him?
I do.
One of the greatest names. I thought he was an exotic sort of lizard of some
salamander
sort.
type.
Salamander type. So if we go back 30 years to the mid-1990s, you have, and this is a very important way to frame this world, because there is a possibility that Donald Trump is the Bill Clinton of the 21st century, not due to his picadillos with younger ladies or ladies in general, right? Bill Clinton's presidency was hemmed in by a very aggressive Republican Party led by Newt Gingrich on the one hand, and by what his Bill Clinton's spokesperson, James Carville, called bond vigilantes on the other. And bond vigilantes were the bond market that consistently, every time Clinton wanted to do something, interest rates, long-term interest rates, were increased by the bond markets. The bond vigilantes sold US bonds that pushed American interest rates up, that pushed up the cost of borrowing for America, and it sort of hemmed Clinton in all the time.
Did they do that deliberately to
change policy in the
right.
White House? So Clinton wanted to have free healthcare for all. It was his first Medicare package. Very sensible, very European. Had they done it, Americans' health on average would be much better than it is.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, they had to borrow lots and lots of money. In order to borrow lots and lots of money, they had to make sure that the market, i.e. the people who were buying American debt, were prepared to accept that American debt at a low interest rate.
Okay.
The market, i.e. Wall Street, decided that no, it wasn't prepared to accept American debt at that interest rate. The interest rate would have had to be higher. And this, of course, increased the cost of Medicare
Right.
and put pressure on Clinton to reduce his slightly left of center ideas. All the while, Newt Gingrich was this new type of Republican politician.
Yeah.
So in the past, you would have had what they call sort of one nation Republicans, right? Rockefeller Republicans, who were almost the patrician class. And this patrician class, best exemplified by Bush the senior,
Yeah.
George W. Bush, his father, George Bush,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That they were sort of the ascendancy, the WASPs, that they would look after
These are the
country.
neocons.
No, but these was before the neocons,
Okay.
right? So the neocons come later. Now, Gingrich is kind of the parochial father of the neocons. The neocons really wanted to project American power abroad, and they come to their peak with Donald Rumsfeld in around 2002 and 3, when he is the foreign secretary of George Bush W,
Yeah.
the son.
Yeah. Yeah.
But prior to that, there would have been these Republicans who were basically what they call in England one nation Tories, one nation Republicans. And they'd always do a deal with the Democrats. They'd be very, very friendly. These are the sort of thing. You'd see Tip O'Neill and Patrick Moynihan doing deals with the
Yeah,
Republicans of their.
And that's where Biden kind of thrived as well.
Biden was in that world as
Yeah.
well. Doing deals, do you need a hospital in your state? Yeah, okay, we'll get the money for that as long as you support me on this, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
When Gingrich arrives in, fueled by a messianic obsession that government is wrong, which was basically a Reaganite idea. So Reagan was the one who came up with the 8 most terrifying words in the English
Yeah.
languages. I am here from the government and I'm going to do something for you.
Yeah.
Something like that, right?
Yeah.
So there was
I'm here
always,
to help.
I'm here to help, right? So there was always this strain in the Republican Party, but it comes under Gingrich, and Gingrich is the one that starts saying, lock down the government, close down Capitol Hill. And of course, Clinton masterfully, what they would call triangulated your man Gingrich. But the point is, we're back in that world. And the bond vigilantes are back. Now, James Carville,
Yeah.
who was Clinton's spokesperson, when he was asked what he would have liked to be when he came back, if there was ever reincarnation, he said, I want to come back as the bond market. So it's basically the bond vigilantes with a big stick disciplining the government.
Yeah.
Now, since inflation has not been a problem for the Americans from, let's say, the mid-90s to about 2020, 22, when it reemerges in the pandemic, the bond vigilantes disappeared. What I suggest is they're going to be back in the game next year.
Right. Okay.
And it will be the Democratic Party that will be doing what Gingrich was doing to Clinton. The Democratic Party will be doing this to Trump, consistently trying to trip him up all the time. But the soft underbelly of MAGA is the fact, and this is the key, that the Americans are not only the world's largest debtor, but they are the largest debtor the world has ever seen, ever. That is their weakness.
Okay.
So the Americans are going to spend the next, when I say the Americans, the Trump administration
Yeah.
and the various different players ahead of the inauguration are, we see it now, are spending all their time saying, we're going to do this, you're going to do this. If you don't buy American oil, we'll put tariffs on you. If you don't, we'll put tariffs on you. La, la. And they're basically saying, they're walking around saying that we're going to do whatever we want to whoever we want at whatever time we want. And you're going to have to suck it up because we're the big boys.
Yeah, they're the new shapers on the block.
We're back in the game. Yeah, they're new shapers. Yeah, exactly. Wrangler parallels.
Yeah,
right?
That's exactly it. Yeah,
Bay
that's what I have an
City-
image
A
of.
Bay City roller, Chris down the side. Tartan, right? 1973, I bring it back. All right.
Yeah, boot boys.
Boot boys. Yeah, exactly. Boot boys, right? So that's what they're doing. Now, the thing about being a boot boy and being a big lad and we're going to take our money home and la, 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 that's all great if you are the world's creditor.
Yeah.
But if you are the world's debtor and you exist and your debt is financed by other people, maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't throw so many shapes.
Yeah.
Because there comes a moment where maybe the rest of the world says, you know what? We don't fancy buying your debt anymore. We don't fancy investing in your stock market anymore. The American stock market is going up because foreigners are buying the stuff.
Yeah.
The American bond market is going up because foreigners are buying it. So what I want to get into is the reality that America as a debtor is not half as tough and as strong as it suggests. It's throwing shapes, but shapers always throw shapes.
Yeah.
They don't really follow up. So this is the big question. This is an outlier. This is not a forecast for 2025. It's just something to throw out there on the table.
It's in the background. It's the context. Okay, well, what's the big deal then, Mac, of being, so much in debt? I mean, they have been for years, and they're doing all right. Thanks very much.
That's true. Yeah. So they're doing all right. Thanks very much, because the rest of the world is happy to finance. So I'll just give you a top line figure before I explain it. American government debt is about $30 trillion. That is about, which is a mad figure, about 100% of American GDP.
Right. Okay.
Now, at low rates of interest, that's all financeable. But if the rate of interest rises, that might not necessarily be so financeable. But let me give you much more the psychology of debt. The problem is that when you are in enormous debt, you are in effect dependent on the kindness of strangers, the strangers who finance everything.
Yeah.
And that means you're also highly likely to be encumbered by the law of unintended consequences, that you don't control your own destiny. Somebody else controls your destiny. And even the Americans that have the dollar and have the Fed and all that sort of stuff, they still have to face the reality that they cannot pay their bills every week, which comes back to your government shutdown idea.
Yeah.
Now, if you are dependent, you're a hostage to other events. And maybe the last month gives you a good example of that. In Assad, in Syria.
Right.
So Assad is deposed in Syria in the last few weeks, but he's deposed simply because he was dependent on Russia, on Iran, and on Hezbollah. He didn't have his own power base. His own army, his own structures weren't strong enough. So he'd basically outsourced lots and lots of stuff to other people. And he was dependent on them making calculations, split-second calculations, about whether it was right to support him or not, or whether in fact he'd gone too far. So you get October 7th, Hamas launches its attack on Israel. Very few people were talking about this will end up being the trigger that will be the end of Assad.
Yeah.
But, Hamas have a go at Israel, then Hezbollah have a go at Israel, and Israel strikes back, then Israel defangs Hezbollah, then Hezbollah don't have any power, then Assad doesn't have any foot soldiers because they were the foot soldiers that did all the killing for him. Then you have Iran, the Israelis take out the Iranians, or at least cause the Iranians to think again.
Yeah.
They destroy Hamas. And gradually, this all sends a signal to the jihadis to have a go. And
Which they do.
And of course, the people who read the room brilliantly were the Turks.
Yeah.
Turks read the room, and before you know it, Assad is in Moscow in exile, and the regime is over. Now that shows you how things can move very, very quickly when you are not in control of your own destiny.
Mm.
Now, the comparison with Assad is only illustrative in the sense that this can happen, right? Because you don't have the power. It's always the weakest link in the chain that gets you. Now, what is the weakest link in the MAGA chain? It's the American budget deficit and the inability of American savings to finance America's needs, leading to a large debt burden, which in and of itself is dependent on the bond market financing everything,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, up until now, so the swagger that the MAGA lads have is like, we've got the greatest stock market, we've got the greatest bond market,
Yeah.
all of that.
We're self-sufficient in energy.
We're self-sufficient in energy, but it's all financed in the very short to medium term by foreigners lending the United States money. So by savings moving from China, from Japan, and from Europe to America.
Yeah.
Now, again, the Yanks at this moment are pointing their fingers at everyone. The Canadians, the Mexicans, the Chinese, the Europeans, right? Could you imagine if somebody says, or a coalition of countries says, you know what? Fuck you.
But last week you were talking about the power of America.
And it is very powerful.
But you're saying it may not remain so.
What I'm saying is, cosmetically, America is unbelievably powerful. It's the place to be. It's the one with all the innovative companies, with all the very dynamic tech sector, all that sort of stuff. It's innovative, etc. But it's bragging a little bit too much at the moment, right? MAGA has fueled it with a certain amount of manifest destiny that lots of the other parts of the world are saying, well, hold on a second, you're only 5% of the global population.
Yeah.
That means 95% of the globe are not American.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of, so my point is, let's just see a little bit of humility from the Yanks now would, I think, help them enormously.
So let's talk about some figures. Put this into context for us.
Okay, so this year, the American budget deficit will be $2 trillion.
Just this year alone.
Yeah, and half of that is net interest payment on debt, which is more than they spend on their entire military. So we think the American military is huge. It's about $1 trillion spent every year. They spend the same amount on just servicing their national debt. Total government debt about 30 trillion. That's 100% out of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office estimates by 2034, which isn't that far away, 10 years' time, right?
Yeah.
American government debt will exceed 50 trillion, or about 123% of GDP.
Wow.
It will be spending then 1.7 trillion on interest payments alone. Now,
It's really hard to get your head around these figures.
Incredibly hard to get your head around these figures, right? But just to understand that American GDP is about 30 trillion. So it'll be spending a phenomenal amount on just interest payments alone to keep the whole thing ticking over, right? Soon, America's debt as a percentage of GDP is going to surpass the peak of its total debt at the end of the Second World War, where it had galvanized the entire economy to fight the war. It nationalized everything, right? And then after the Second World War, you had two things. Interest rates fell very dramatically and the economy grew. So they grew their way out of debt very quickly. But that's not on the cards now. You're not going to have 1950s style economic growth in the United States, 3, 4, 5%. It's just not going to happen. Best case scenario is 2% growth.
Right. But if they pull all their industry back to America, well then...
Yeah, but I'm going to give you some more figures, right? If they pull all their industry back, which is what Lutnick and all these guys are saying, we want our money back, right?
Yeah,
okay. It still doesn't mean that America is a net creditor. The Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of the central bankers, say that the United States, even if they sold all their foreign assets, brought all their money back home, they would still have a net debt position of $14 trillion.
Right.
So if you take the balance sheet of America between their liabilities, what they owe the rest of the world, and what they own outside, and you net them all off, the United States would still have a 14 trillion deficit. Now, that is a very, very, very big number.
Are we in completely uncharted territory here?
Now, that's the fascinating question, John. It has happened before,
Oh,
right?
okay.
We have been here before where a massive financial global imperial power goes from being a creditor to a debtor in a quick and very, very, very dramatic fashion. And the rest of its history changes profoundly.
Who?
And that country is Britain.
Okay, yes.
Goes from being the global creditor to a massive debtor, and its world changes completely, right? From 1914 to 1918, Britain's position shifts in the First World War.
Yeah.
And it was never, ever, ever after 1918 the player it was before that. Now, why is this, right? It's because the First World War profoundly changed the world's financial architecture. So in 1914, Britain was the world's banker. It controlled around 20 billion of foreign assets.
Right.
London was the epicenter of global money, and it accounted for 2/3 of all trade in international finance. So it was enormous.
Yeah.
There had been an unprecedented boom under what they call the gold standard era, which was about 1870 to 1914 in international trade. But there also had been, like there is now, once you have international trade, you have international capital flows. So countries financing other countries, etc. So what you got on the eve of the First World War is an arrangement like the following. France had lent loads and loads of money to lots of other countries, as to it Britain and as to it Germany. But the French had overseas assets amounting to $9 billion. There was investments overseas. Right?
Huge money in those
Huge
days.
money in those days, of which an extraordinary $5 billion was invested in Russia. The French took a massive bet on Russian railways and Russian industrialization.
Okay.
And Russian industrialized monumentally in the years leading up to the Russian Revolution. And a huge amount of that was financed overseas because the Russians didn't have their own money. They didn't have their own capital.
Yeah.
So the French financed that, right? Of course, the communists arrive in 1917 and they default on everything.
Yes.
Leaving the French $5 billion out of pocket. Other European countries, obviously then, when the First World War happened, had to sell all their assets to raise money to finance the war, to pay the soldiers, to pay for armaments, to pay for bombs, etc., etc., etc. And they all borrowed from the one country that remained aloof, America.
Right.
So America was the only country that had money and didn't have to spend it. So what did they do? They lent it to everyone. So America emerged as the world's undisputed creditor after the war.
Right.
Britain, France, Germany, everybody, well, not Britain and France in particular, owed a huge amount of money to America. So the Americans then were owed billions. And what did they do? They snapped up more assets in Europe at real bargain basement prices, again, with this money. But the global shift in power, everybody always says, when did the Americans arrive on the scene?
Yeah.
They arrived on the scene after the First World War because they had all the money. Now think about what happened to Britain. Britain went from a country which is the global creditor to a massive debtor. Those debts they had to incur to fight the First World War. The period of the 1920s were a total humiliation for Britain. There were a time when the pound was on the gold standard, was off the gold standard. Money was flowing in and out of the UK. The pound sterling started to degrade. It started to lose its value. And over time, it lost 80% of its value against the dollar up until the Second World War. So my point is, right at the moment, we are looking at the dollar's never been stronger. The American bond market's never been stronger. The cautionary lesson from America is Britain. You can lose an empire, but you first have to lose control over finances. And how you lose control over finances is you depend on too many foreigners to pay your bills, which is what the British got into this problem in 1918. I have a theory that we wouldn't be independent if Britain hadn't lost its financial muscle.
Oh, right. Okay.
Because part of divesting abroad of all their assets and all their colonial treasures and all was they didn't have the money to fight.
Yeah.
Something changed in the British mentality in between about 1918 and 1920, And I don't think you can see that without appreciating just this shift in money.
So let's just go back to America now for a sec. If this MAGA movement, and they're shaping around the place and pointing fingers and being, the tough guys,
Yeah.
they seem to be saying that we have a plan and we're going to kick ass.
Yeah.
But is that really the case? But before you answer that, let's do a bit of this.
Grant.
So we're talking about America and its precarious position.
Yeah, it's reasonably not. Let's not over-egg it. It is a fundamental flaw in the MAGA logic, is what I'm saying.
But the interesting thing about the MAGA logic or the MAGA movement is that the administration is going to be full of billionaires. And as you know, that billionaires have a particular view of the world. So are they kind of missing something, do you think?
Interesting you say billionaires, John. I think it's very important to appreciate. We're talking about billionaires and debt. The vast majority of the billionaires that are around Trump are financial speculators.
Right.
They are people who have got rich during periods of default, during periods of profound market changes. They have used leverage. They have used low interest rates. They have bought back stocks. They are financial engineers, in effect. Elon Musk is an engineer, but he's more of a financial engineer than anything else.
Yeah.
Like Trump himself, a perennial debtor, right?
Yeah.
These are people who've gone into debt, who've defaulted, who've gone bankrupt, they've got back again, right? So their worldview is that money can be used as a tool to acquire power, right? That's the first thing. The second thing to look at these billionaires is that, ironically, if you look at who defaults most, rich people are poor people. You'd imagine poor people, but in fact, it's rich people. Rich people are usually very cavalier with other people's money, right? The average poor person knows that the penalty for default is much higher if you're poor than if you're rich.
Yeah.
So, for example, even in this country, when all those billionaires went bust after the crash, they all went off to England for a couple of years.
Yes.
And they came back.
Yeah.
And it was all as if nothing had happened.
Started again, yeah.
Whereas if you're, living in a council house and you start defaulting on your electricity bill, you get cut off.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's a totally different. This comes from Muhammad Yunus, the micro banker in Bangladesh who won the Nobel Prize for microbanking. He saw that poor women in particular are the best financial bet. And rich, mega rich men are the worst because they default, and it's a mark of sort of macho-ness.
Yeah.
So that's the mentality that is in the MAGA top table. And that also suggests that they don't understand or appreciate what can happen to a country if it begins to look like a financial delinquent.
But they're also, we were just talking about Elon Musk earlier, and he's now going to be head of this new department, Doge, and all that kind of stuff. And he's going to slash spending on everything. But it is this kind of mentality and approach to government that's more akin to running a company than running a country.
Yeah. And we do
and they're
know
very, very different
they're
things.
They're very, very different things. I think it's no doubt that America needs to maybe have a look at its bureaucracy if it decides it's a bit too flabby around the gills, to cut it a wee bit. I've no doubt, because they need to get this $2 trillion deficit down, because at the source of their problem is an inability to balance the books. But the reason they have an inability to balance the books is because of tax cuts.
Yeah.
America could balance the books in the morning if they decide to increase taxes.
Right.
But it chooses not to.
Yeah.
So they're hoping for the best of all worlds. They want growth, they want income, they want asset price inflation, and they want low taxes.
Yeah.
And they want the rest of the world to finance them. What
Yeah.
I'm saying is, it's not a central case. In fact, it would be a disaster for the world if we decided not to support the Americans financially, because you'd see massive capital flows back into Europe, back into China. We wouldn't know what to do with the money. There'd be, so we can talk about that in another podcast.
Right.
But
Well, I
just-
think there's lots of stuff we can do with the money, actually.
Exactly. We can. So, but just to conclude, this is not the central forecast, but I'll just conclude on Trump, right?
Mhm.
What we do know about Trump is that he will do unpredictable things. So the range of possibilities that can go right and go wrong will expand dramatically under this new administration, right? And once the range of possibilities increases, it means there's more things in play. And therefore, there's more things that can actually go wrong. And because the world economy is enmeshed like never before, if you think the period before the First World War was bad,
Yeah.
we are much more interrelated now, right? It means that the things that are in play now because Trump is in power are much greater. And when there's much more stuff going on, there's a much greater possibility of chaos. And that, I think, is where the fragilities are. And one of America's main fragilities is indebtedness. Now, it could, as I said before, solve all this by raising taxes.
Yeah.
But ideologically, they don't want to raise taxes. And now, interestingly, this may just be the guardrail that the world needs. If in the course of the next year, and I think this is going to happen, the American bond market begins to sell off. What I mean by that is people say, we're not going to finance the Americans at this rate of interest. We want a higher rate of interest.
Yeah.
The bond vigilantes, to come back to Clinton, will reemerge out of the shadows, John. You can imagine a vigilante, hard show in the shadows. You're just leaving the pub, you're staggering around, you're thinking it, and then up that dark lane. Up that dark lane, you think, I'll take a shortcut to the bus, is the vigilante with a big stick, right? Just when you think you're almost home, he strikes. Now, that's the same idea. So keep that image in your head. I think those geezers will be back in the frame. And I come back to the basic idea that if you are a creditor, you can throw shapes credibly. But if you are a debtor, you are dependent on the kindness of strangers. And in order to acquire the kindness of strangers and guarantee it, you got to be kind to the strangers.
Yeah.
And if you're not kind to the strangers, they might just pull the rug. And the rug is the American bond market. And the underlying fragility is their indebtedness. And it is now 100% of GDP. And that's when all the red lights start to flash.